The wind, a jagged whisper through the skeletal branches of ponderosa pines, offered no comfort. It clawed at the tattered canvas of the overturned wagon, tearing at the last vestiges of shelter. Snow, relentless and indifferent, had buried the world in a shroud of purest, deadliest white, stretching a stark canvas across the Montana plains. Beneath the wreckage, huddled amidst threadbare blankets and the faint, bitter scent of desperation, a figure barely breathed. Alara, no more than 20, felt the cold seep into her very bones, a creeping paralysis that promised an end to the gnawing hunger, the profound ache of loneliness. Her lips were cracked, her breath a shallow puff of vapor. Days had blurred into an endless white oblivion since Mama had finally stilled, her last breath a frail gasp against the icy air. Alara had tried to dig, to bury, but the earth was a tomb of ice, unyielding. So she had merely covered her, wrapped her in the warmest shawl, and whispered promises. Now she was simply waiting for the same stillness to claim her. A sound, faint as a moth's wing beat against the vast silence, reached her. The rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on packed snow. It was too soon for rescue, too far from anywhere. Fear, a cold serpent, coiled in her stomach, momentarily eclipsing the numbness. She tried to shrink deeper into the folds of her coat, to become one with the frozen earth. A shadow fell over the wagon. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the blinding glare of snow and sky. A man stood silhouetted against the pale winter light, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the wide brim of his hat and the low angle of the sun. He didn't speak, only surveyed the scene with an unervingly still gaze. His presence was one of quiet authority, not malicious, but utterly unyielding, like the land itself. A long rifle was slung across his back, and the air around him hummed with an innate competence. He was a rancher, by the look of his worn leather chaps and the way he moved, familiar with solitude and hardship. He moved closer, his boots disturbing the pristine snow. Alara saw his eyes, then the color of deep river stone, neither kind nor cruel, but observant, assessing. He knelt slowly, his movements deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the meager belongings strewn about the wreck. A dented kettle, a single porcelain doll missing an arm, a worn Bible. His eyes landed on Alara, her face a mask of frostbite and exhaustion. She tried to recoil, but her limbs refused to obey. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur escaped her chapped lips, born of delirium and a deep-seated ache. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, her voice a reedy rasp. "I'll be kind." Always kind. The rancher paused, his hand, gloved and calloused, hovering inches from her face. His gaze deepened, a flicker of something unreadable in those stone-like eyes. He saw not just a dying girl, but the ghost of a promise, fragile and profound, hanging in the biting air. The truth, veiled by her delirium, had touched something within him, a silent bell in the vast, empty landscape. He remained speechless, his posture rigid, the wind his only witness. Silas moved, not with haste, but with the efficiency of a man accustomed to hard tasks and little complaint. He didn't offer empty platitudes or feign sympathy. Instead, he simply extended his hand, a silent command rather than an invitation. Alara, too weak to refuse, felt his grip firm and steady as he helped her extract herself from the debris, her limbs stiff and protesting. The journey to his cabin, a distant smudge of smoke against the white horizon, was a blur of shivering and the jarring rhythm of his long strides as he half-carried, half-supported her. The air within the cabin was thick with the scent of pine smoke, wood, and something wild dried herbs, perhaps, or the faint musk of animals. It was small, crude, yet remarkably warm, a sanctuary in the heart of the unforgiving winter. He settled her by the stone hearth, the roaring fire casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He poured a mug of hot, milky broth, its steam a comforting caress against her frozen face. He watched her drink, his expression unreadable. He asked no questions. This silence, initially unsettling, slowly began to feel like a strange mercy. No prying eyes, no demands for explanation, only the quiet crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his own presence. Alara found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. His hands, though strong, moved with a surprising gentleness as he tended to the fire or poured more broth. He lived alone, that was clear. His cabin, though clean, bore the mark of a bachelor's solitary existence. Sparse furnishings, hunting trophies on the walls, a stack of worn books by his crude bedside table. He was a man of routines, of quiet competence. She watched him mend a bridle, his fingers deft and sure, and felt a flicker of something akin to admiration, an unbidden respect for his self-sufficiency. As days bled into weeks, the grip of the cold eased, replaced by a tentative thaw. Alara's body slowly shed its numbness, the ache in her bones receding, replaced by a growing awareness of her own fragility and the immense debt she owed. Silas, always taciturn, continued his quiet tending. He left food for her, fresh water, extra blankets. He went about his ranch duties, feeding the few head of cattle, mending fences, setting traps, returning each evening with the scent of pine and cold air clinging to him. He never pressed her about her past, never mentioned the words she'd whispered in her delirium. Yet, she felt the weight of them, the unspoken promise. Her mother had instilled in her a deep-seated belief in kindness, even in the face of cruelty. It was a principle that had often felt like a burden in the harsh world they had navigated. But now, in this quiet, watchful man's presence, it began to feel like her truest compass. One afternoon, a sharp, mournful howl echoed from the distant hills. Alara, startled, saw Silas's head snap up, his eyes narrowing. It was a wolf, too close, too bold. He grabbed his rifle, preparing to leave. A flicker of fear crossed her face, the vulnerability of the lone rancher, the harshness of the land striking again. She watched him go, a sudden, profound sense of gratitude blossoming in her chest. It was not just for her survival, but for the quiet, unasked-for shelter he provided, the silent understanding he offered. The cabin felt too large, too empty without him. She was no longer just waiting to die. She was waiting for him to return. The slow build of trust was not in grand gestures or eloquent words, but in the steadfastness of a man who simply, quietly, did what was necessary, offering a sanctuary where she could begin to heal, where the bitter promise of the world outside might finally be softened by the steady warmth of a stranger's fire. The spring thaw brought a resurgence of life, but also a fresh wave of challenges. Runoff swelled the creeks, threatening a vital section of Silas's fence line, where a small herd of calves was penned. He'd been working from dawn to dusk, his lean frame taut with exhaustion, the worry lines etched deeper around his eyes. Alara, now stronger, though still slight, could no longer bear to sit idly by. Her hands, though calloused from their hard journey, held a quiet competence. She had watched him meticulously repair tools, mend leather, observed the practical economy of his movements. "I can help," she said one morning, her voice still quiet, but steadier now. He paused, his gaze assessing, then simply nodded, handing her a coil of rope and a pair of worn gloves. She proved surprisingly adept. Her fingers, nimble and precise, managed knots that often frustrated him, her steady focus matching his own. They worked in a rhythm, silent for hours, the only sounds the rushing water, the thud of hammer on wood, the grunt of effort. The physical labor was a balm, a way to channel the restless energy that had gathered during her long convalescence. It grounded her, making her feel less like a burden and more like a contributor. But the weather was fickle. A sudden, late-season squall swept in, a vicious mix of driving rain and sleet, turning the already treacherous ground into a slippery mire. The creek, already swollen, roared to a dangerous torrent, tearing at the newly repaired fence. A young calf, panicked, slipped through a gap and was swept into the churning water. Silas, without a second thought, plunged into the frigid current. Alara gasped. The water was icy, dangerous, pulling at his boots. He reached for the calf, but the current was too strong. dragging them both downstream. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Instinct took over. Without hesitation, she grabbed the thickest rope she could find, tied one end to a sturdy pine, and holding the other, braced herself against a rock, calling out. Her voice, though small, cut through the roar of the water. "Silas! The rope!" He saw her, a flash of surprise in his eyes, but grabbed for the rope she cast, his arms snaking around the calf. Slowly, painfully, she pulled, her muscles screaming in protest, the raw rope biting into her hands. It was a slow, agonizing tug-of-war against the raging creek, but she held fast, her jaw set, her focus absolute. Finally, with a desperate heave from Silas and a final surge of strength from Alara, they pulled the calf to shore, both of them soaked, shivering but safe. Silas lay panting on the muddy bank, the calf a shivering bundle beside him. He looked at Alara, his eyes, usually so guarded, now wide with a dawning realization. Her hair, plastered to her face, revealed the fierce determination in her gaze, a resilience that had been hidden beneath layers of grief and fear. He had seen her vulnerability, her quiet despair, but this was new. This was a quiet, unyielding strength that surprised him. She didn't boast, didn't even meet his gaze, instead immediately turning to check on the shivering calf. The truth wasn't in her words, but in her actions, a profound, unexpected kindness, not just to a creature, but to him, risking herself without a moment's thought. It was a selfless act, an echo of her earlier whispered promise. He found himself utterly speechless, humbled by the quiet power he'd witnessed, a profound respect settling deep in his chest. The late spring snows finally melted entirely, revealing a landscape reborn, vibrant green pushing through the brown. The ranch, no longer a temporary haven, had become a place of shared purpose. Alara worked alongside Silas, the work shaping her, hardening her hands, yes, but also softening the edges of her grief. She learned the land's rhythms, the animals' needs, the unspoken language of the solitary rancher. Their conversations remained sparse, yet each shared glance, each shared task, wove another thread into the quiet tapestry of their connection. The cabin no longer felt empty to Silas. The subtle scent of Alara's presence, sun-dried linen, the faint fragrance of wild mint she used in tea permeated the air, a silent, comforting hum. One evening, as the last rays of sun painted the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, Alara sat by the hearth, mending a tear in Silas's coat. The silence was companionable, but a question had long weighed on Silas. He cleared his throat. "That first day," he began, his voice rough, "what you whispered about being kind. To your mama." Alara paused, her needle still, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames, the story finally ready to be told. "Mama, she was different," Alara began, her voice low, a quiet cadence of memory. "She saw beauty where others saw only hardship. She'd speak to the plants, to the sky. Folks in town, they called her a witch or just plain touched. After Papa died, they wanted to take everything, said she was unfit, that I needed to be civilized among them. Mama wouldn't let them. We left. She was always teaching me, even when we were cold and hungry, that the greatest strength was to choose kindness, even when the world offered none. That bitterness, it was a cage. She said to always remember her, not for their harsh words, but for the quiet kindness she held in her heart." Her voice caught. When she passed, out there in the snow, her last words to me were a plea. "Alara," she whispered, her voice so weak, "don't let their unkindness make you unkind. Be kind, Alara. Be kind always," I promised her. I told her I would. Alara looked up then, her eyes clear, steady, vulnerable but not broken. It wasn't just a promise for her. It was a promise for myself. To remember what she was, not what they said she was. To live by her truth. Silas listened, motionless. The full weight of her journey, the unjust suffering, the profound dignity of her mother's final wish, settled over him. It wasn't just a girl he had saved. It was a testament to enduring grace, a fierce loyalty to a truth others had scorned. He saw not a fragile survivor, but a woman forged by fire and ice, carrying a torch of quiet, defiant kindness. He had no words. His own life had been one of hard solitude, born of a different kind of wound, a world that had offered him little tenderness. Her story, stark in its simplicity, left him speechless, not in shock, but in a profound sense of awe and recognition. He saw a mirror of his own resilience, but tempered by an emotional depth he hadn't thought possible. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture that conveyed more than any torrent of words. It was acceptance, understanding, and an unspoken offer of belonging. The ranch, once a refuge born of necessity, had become home. Alara had found her strength, not in forgetting her past, but in honoring it, in fulfilling the quiet, powerful truth her mother had instilled. The world outside remained harsh, but within the confines of Silas's ranch, under the vast, watchful sky, two solitary souls had found a quiet partnership, a silent pact of resilience and, against all odds, a profound and enduring kindness.